She paved her dugout with empty bottles. Enoch Pryor, who had freighted 12 Dakota winters and buried a son to the cold, told her flat, "Sleep your girl on that wet dirt, you will wake beside a body." She had $31, one daughter, and no way to raise a floor before the freeze. On November 14th, 1880, the temperature dropped 50 degrees in 9 hours. But 10 weeks earlier, Ruth Calder had never built a floor in her life. She had arrived at the claim in August of 1880, riding beside a man who could still sit upright on the wagon bench. Matthew Calder had coughed blood into his sleeve the last 4 miles, but kept his hand on the reins because the ox pulling them had gone lame on the left foreleg and drifted without correction. Elsie slept in the bed of the wagon between a flour sack and a crate of nails. She was 6 years old and had not yet learned that her father was dying. The claim sat on a low rise above a creek bend in southeastern Dakota Territory, 7 miles from the nearest settlement and 40 from the railroad at De Smet. What Matthew had filed on was 160 acres of grass, clay, and wind. What he had built before the sickness took him told a different story. A dugout cut into the creek bank, not deep, not well squared, just a wound in the hillside with a shovel's signature on every wall, a front wall of sod blocks and scrap planks hauled from a collapsed freight station 12 miles south, a roof of cottonwood poles, brush, and packed earth that sagged in the center where the weight had not been calculated right. One small iron stove with a pipe that leaned 2 degrees off vertical, which meant smoke backed into the room when the wind came from the north, which on the Dakota plains it almost always did. Less than a cord of split wood stacked against the south-facing wall, where rain had already softened the bottom pieces to punk. No finished floor, just packed damp earth that held the cold the way a stone holds water, quietly, completely, and from below. Matthew died 9 days after they reached the claim. The fever broke him in the night while Ruth sat on an overturned bucket beside the pallet and listened to his breathing turn shallow, then ragged, then stop. She pressed her fingers to the side of his throat and held them there for a long time, longer than she needed to, because removing them meant the next thing had to happen, and she was not ready for the next thing. She buried him on the rise where the grass was thinnest because the clay there was easier to cut with the one shovel they owned. The hole took her all day. She hit stone at 3 feet and had to widen the cut to get around it. By the time she lowered the blanket-wrapped body with a rope looped under the arms, her shoulders were shaking and her vision swam from the heat and the effort and the thing she was not allowing herself to feel because feeling it would stop her hands. Elsie stood at the edge of the hole and asked when he was coming back. Ruth said, "He is resting." It was the first lie. There would be others. She had $31 in a tobacco tin under the wagon seat, 12 pounds of flour, a sack of salt pork going rancid at the edges, coffee enough for 3 weeks if she halved each pot, 4 hens that had survived the journey, though one had stopped laying, 1 lame ox she could neither ride nor sell, and a homestead claim that required her continuous residence and improvement to hold. If she left, the claim reverted. The land, Matthew's burial plot included, would pass to the next filer. She would arrive back in Iowa with a child, no husband, no money, and no home to return to. Her parents were dead, her mother from diphtheria in '76, her father from a fall in the Cooperage 2 years later. Her sister had married a man named Clement, who made clear at the funeral that extra mouths were not welcome. He had said it exactly that way, in front of Ruth, with her sister looking at the floor. Ruth Calder could not leave. She could not afford lumber. She could not hire help. And winter on the Dakota plains was not a season that waited for widows to find their footing. The first person to tell her she would fail was the most qualified to know. Enoch Pryor rode onto the claim on a mule in the second week of September. He was 63 years old and had spent 12 winters freighting supplies between Yankton and the interior settlements along routes that existed only when the snow allowed them. He had built 3 sod houses with his own hands. He had buried one son after a February haul went wrong. The boy wandered from the wagon in a whiteout near Chamberlain and was found stiff in a coulee 2 days later, his hands still inside his coat, as though he had been trying to stay warm when the cold stopped him. Pryor's face looked like it had been carved from the same clay as the creek bank, and his opinion carried the weight of a man who had paid for every word of it. He did not introduce himself. He tied the mule, walked to the dugout, ducked through the low doorway, and stood inside for a long time without speaking. Ruth watched him from the threshold, with a hand on Elsie's shoulder. Pryor stamped the floor twice with his boot heel. The sound was dull and wet, like hitting a soaked log. "Who framed this?" he said. "My husband." "Your husband is where?" "On the rise." Pryor looked at her then, not with pity, with the same expression a man uses to count cattle before a storm, measuring, calculating, deciding what can be saved and what cannot. He walked the perimeter of the room, which did not take long, 12 by 14 feet. He pressed his palm flat against the sod wall and held it there for 3 seconds. He examined the stovepipe joint where it entered the roof. He crouched and laid his full hand against the floor and kept it there, motionless, for what felt like a full minute. "Tell me what you have," he said, still crouching. "Flour, salt pork, coffee, 4 hens, the stove, some tools, wood." "What is stacked outside?" "That is not wood. That is maybe 1.5 cords if you count the soft pieces, which I would not. You need 6 cords minimum to burn from November through March, and that number assumes your stove draws proper, which it does not because the pipe leans, and it assumes you never let the fire die overnight, which you will because you are one woman and you have to sleep." He stood, his knees cracked like dry sticks. "The roof will hold snow, but it will leak at the seams when temperature swings," he said. "You have no tar and no canvas to seal it with. The front wall has gaps at the sill where the planking does not meet the sod, and the wind will find every one of them. You could pack those with mud and straw, and you should, but that is not what will kill you." He looked at the floor. "The floor is your death," he said. "Not the walls, not the roof, not the stovepipe, the floor. You're sleeping on wet earth. The cold does not come through the door, or it does, but that is not the danger that matters. It comes through the ground, it comes up through the packed dirt, and it takes the warmth out of a body faster than the air ever will, because the air moves and you can heat it, but the earth does not move. It just pulls. All night, every night, and it never tires. By January, the frost line will be down 3 feet, and the ground beneath this room will be frozen solid, and that floor will be like sleeping on river ice with a blanket between you and the surface." "What would you do?" Ruth asked. "I would build a plank floor. Joists, planks, air gap beneath. That is the answer. That has always been the answer." "I cannot afford planks." "Then I would find someone who can, a relative, a church, someone." "There is no one." Pryor pulled his hat off and rubbed the back of his neck. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, not gentle, just quieter the way a man speaks when he is delivering a verdict he does not enjoy. "If you sleep your little girl on wet dirt this winter," he said, "you will wake beside a body." He put the hat back on, ducked through the doorway, untied the mule, and left. He did not offer to help. He had told her the truth as he understood it, and in his experience, the truth was all a person could spare on the plains because everything else cost something. That night, Ruth lay on the pallet beside Elsie and pressed her palm to the floor the way Pryor had. The earth was cool, not freezing, not yet. September was still mild enough to deceive. But beneath the cool, there was something heavier, a slow, patient draw that pulled warmth from her hand the way a wick pulls oil. She could feel the difference between the air above, which the stove had warmed to something bearable, and the ground below, which the stove could not reach and never would. She thought about Pryor's face when he said the word death. He had not been cruel, he had been accurate. And accuracy on the frontier was the cruelest thing of all. She rolled onto her back and stared at the earth ceiling and thought, the danger is not above me, it is below. The next week she went to the settlement and priced lumber at the mercantile. Sawn pine planks cost 18 cents a running foot when they were available, which they often were not, because freight from the railroad was irregular and demand from new settlers outstripped every shipment. To floor the dugout, she would need joists sawn to span the width, cross bracing to keep them from racking, and enough board to cover 168 square feet with overlap for waste and cutting. The storekeeper, a patient man named Aldous Kipp, who had the unusual frontier quality of doing arithmetic without rounding in his own favor, scratched the figures on a piece of brown paper. $41, Kipp said. That is planks and joists. Nails are separate. Delivery I cannot promise before freeze up. Ruth looked at the number on the paper. She had $29. 2 of those she already owed to Kipp for coffee, and thread purchased on account. Is there cheaper lumber? She said. There is no lumber at all some weeks. Cheaper is not the problem. Supply is the problem. She thanked him and walked back along the wagon track with Elsie riding on her hip, because the child's shoes had split at the sole, and the grass stubble cut bare feet. The sun was warm on her back. September on the plains could fool a body into believing the year had stopped, that warmth was permanent, that winter was a rumor from old men. But Ruth had counted the days. She had listened to Pryor. She had watched the cottonwood leaves along the creek turn early and curl at the edges, as though the trees themselves were flinching from something they could feel, and she could not. Time was the one thing she did not have enough of, and it was the one thing that could not be bartered, gathered, or buried in the floor. The idea did not come all at once. It came in pieces, the way her father's lessons always had, not as arguments, but as images that surfaced when her hands were busy and her mind was too tired to push them down. She was kneeling on the dugout floor 3 days later, scrubbing at a mud stain left by overnight seepage, where the wall met the earth. The stove was lit. The air near the ceiling was warm enough that Elsie sat on the pallet without her coat. But the floor under Ruth's knees was cold. Not the cold of November. Not yet. The cold of September earth. Patient, damp, and constant. Warmth leaked from her kneecaps into the clay, and the clay accepted it without thanks and asked for more. She sat back on her heels and looked at the floor. Then she looked at the empty whiskey bottle Elsie had found by the creek and carried home because the glass was green and caught the light. It was sitting against the wall near the stove foot. Ruth reached for it. She wrapped both hands around the glass. It was cool, but not cold, not like the earth. The bottle held its temperature the way a sealed room holds its air, passively, quietly, without drawing on anything outside itself. And then the memory came. She was 8 years old, standing in lantern light in the root cellar her father had built under the barn in western Iowa. Her father, Thomas Landry, a cooper by trade who built barrels, casks, and sometimes took jobs lining cellars for neighbors who could afford the work, was crouching on the packed dirt floor with a row of glass bottles laid on their sides in front of him. Green bottles, brown bottles, clear bottles, each one corked or stopped with a rag plug and sealed with wax. He was bedding them neck to neck in dry chaff, pressing them into a shallow trench he had cut along the base of the cellar shelf, where the cold crept up worst through the footings in January. She remembered the smell, wet clay and lamp oil, and the sweetness of old straw. She remembered the sound, the hollow clink of bottle against bottle, a musical sound like someone tapping a row of bells made from earth. She remembered his knuckles, white with dried clay, as he pressed a cork into a green bottle and tapped it once, firmly, with the flat of his knife handle. Why bottles? She had asked. Her father had not answered with a word. He picked up an empty corked bottle and pressed it against her left palm. Then he picked up a bare stone from the cellar wall and pressed it against her right palm. "Which one is colder?" he said. The stone was colder. The bottle was not. "Air does not move inside a bottle," he said. "Air that does not move does not carry the cold. The earth is always cold down here, always pulling. But if you put something between you and the earth that holds still air, the cold slows down. It does not stop. Nothing stops it. But it slows. And on a night when everything else has frozen, sometimes slow is the difference between a live root and a dead one." Ruth had not thought about that cellar in 20 years. She had not thought about the bottles. She had not thought about her father crouching in lantern light, building a barrier between the stored food and the frozen ground with nothing but trash and patience and a principle he understood in his hands before he ever had a word for it. Now she thought about it. She looked at the bottle in her grip. She looked at the floor. She looked at the space between them and saw, for the first time, a plan. The dugout was 12 by 14 feet. The floor was packed damp earth. The cold would come through it all winter long, pulling heat from every body laid against it, and no stove on the plains could fight the entire ground. That was Pryor's truth. But Pryor's solution, planks, joists, an air gap, cost $41 she did not have. Her father's solution cost nothing. It cost bottles, corks, clay, ash, straw, and the work of a woman with no alternative. If she could dig out the top layer of the floor, if she could dry the subgrade with heat from the stove, if she could lay corked bottles on their sides, packed tight, necks alternating to minimize the gaps, if she could fill those gaps with dry clay and ash, then cap the whole surface with a compacted layer of clay mixed with straw and sand thick enough to walk on. If she could do all of that before the freeze came, then the stove would only have to fight the air. The ground would meet not her body, but a bed of sealed glass holding still air in the dark. The pull would slow. Maybe enough. Maybe not. But the alternative was Pryor's prediction, and she could feel the weight of that prediction every time she laid her hand on the bare floor and felt the cold answer back. She needed 400 to 500 bottles to cover the full room. She had one. She had $29. She had a lame ox and a handcart and 2 hands already roughened to leather from a month of digging, hauling, and scrubbing. Ruth set the green bottle on the floor, upright, and stared at it until the stove popped and Elsie looked up from her corner. She could not afford a proper floor, but she could build one the world would laugh at. The problem with a plan born from desperation was that desperation did not make it sound sane. Martha Veen came to the dugout 3 days later. She had heard from her husband, who had heard from a man at the settlement, that Ruth Calder was collecting bottles. The rumor was already taking shape. The Calder widow was hoarding glass, burying rubbish, losing her grip on scents. Martha stood in the dugout doorway and looked at the trench Ruth had begun cutting into the sleeping area floor. A shallow rectangular excavation 4 inches deep, the clay stacked in buckets beside the wall. "What is this?" Martha said. Ruth explained. Every word. The bottles, the corks, the trapped air, the cap layer, the principle her father had taught her. She explained it clearly and without apology, because she had already decided that if the plan was going to fail, it would not be because she had been ashamed to describe it. Martha listened with her arms folded. When Ruth finished, Martha walked to the excavation and nudged a clod of cut clay with her boot. "And you think bottles buried under mud will stop the freeze?" "I think they will slow it." "Slow it?" "The ground pulls heat through contact. If I break the contact with a layer of sealed air, the pull slows. The stove can do the rest." "How do you know that?" "Because my father did it in his cellar for 8 winters and never lost a root store to frost." "A cellar under a barn is not a dugout on open prairie with a 6-year-old sleeping on it." "No, it is not." Martha looked at her. Ruth met the look. Neither woman blinked. Glass breaks, Martha said. Dirt shifts in the freeze. The cap will crack. You will cut the child's feet open and bury what little money you have left in nonsense. I am not spending money. I am spending labor. Labor you need for cutting wood, hauling water, caulking that front wall, patching the roof, and keeping that child fed. You have 8, maybe 10 weeks before true cold. Every hour you spend on this is an hour you're not spending on fuel. That was the argument that landed. Not the glass, not the mud, the time. Martha was right that every hour had a price, and Ruth was gambling hours she could not replace on a floor she could not prove. If the floor does not hold, Ruth said, I lose the work. If I do not build it at all, I lose the child. Martha's jaw tightened. She looked at Elsie, who was sitting outside in the grass pulling seeds from a stalk. Then she looked at Ruth. I think you are wrong, Martha said, but I will not tell you to stop. On the frontier, that was the closest thing to a blessing. The bottles came from where bottles always collected on the plains, behind saloons, in rubbish heaps, along wagon tracks where teamsters and travelers had emptied their last comfort and tossed the glass into the grass. Ruth began collecting in earnest. She hitched the lame ox to the handcart and walked the 7 miles to the settlement every 3rd day. The saloon was the richest source. Whiskey bottles, beer bottles, patent medicine bottles with the labels still glued, ink bottles from the land office, pickle jars with screw tops that she counted as a prize because they sealed without corks. Brown and green and clear. Some whole, some chipped at the lip, a few cracked badly enough that she left them. She sorted by size in the cart and set Elsie to scraping labels while she went door to door asking for corks. Corks were harder than glass. She bartered washing, mending, and egg delivery for every cork and stopper the settlement women had saved in kitchen drawers and canning boxes. Where corks were missing, she cut rag plugs from old flour sacks, rolled them tight, and sealed them with a paste of candle wax and tallow. It was on her 4th collection trip that Silas Brame noticed. She was behind the saloon, loading bottles into the cart, when Brame appeared in the back doorway. He was 46, clean-shaven, and built like a man who lifted kegs for a living, which he did, though only from the wagon to the bar. He owned the saloon and 2 lots in the settlement. He also bought failed homestead claims at discount prices from settlers who could not survive their first year, and resold them to spring arrivals with fresh capital and no idea what they were purchasing. He had made more money from failure than any farmer in the territory had made from success. Ruth's claim was, in Brame's assessment, already his. He had mentioned it to 2 buyers by letter. Building something? Brame said. Not to Ruth. To the 2 men sitting on crates by the back wall, a teamster named Cobb and a cattle hand named Fisher. Looks like she is building a saloon of her own, Fisher said, from the empties. The men laughed. Ruth did not look up. She placed a green bottle into the cart and checked the rag padding between the rows. Every bottle she hauls off my ground, Brame said, loud enough for the street, is 1 board she has not bought. And 1 hour closer to the day, she comes to me asking what her claim is worth. 53, Elsie said from the boardwalk, where she sat with her legs dangling. She was counting bottles as Ruth loaded them. She had not been asked. Brame looked at the child. He looked at Ruth. By Christmas she will beg to sell, he said. Ruth straightened. She did not look at Brame. She looked at Cobb, the teamster, because Cobb was the only one who had not laughed. Ah, sir? Then I suppose you had best pray for a cold winter, she said. She took the cart handle and walked. Elsie climbed down and followed, her bare feet leaving small prints in the dust. Behind them the laughter faded, but Brame watched the cart rattle up the track, with an expression that was not amusement. It was certainty. He had seen widows fight before. He had never seen one win. The laughter carried. Ruth heard it again at Kip's store 3 days later when a woman buying sugar turned away from the counter as she entered. She heard it in the voice of the freight driver who asked if she wanted him to haul glass or lumber because he could do one but not both, and the way he said glass made it clear which one he thought was a waste of his time. She heard it in the silence of the women at the water pump who stopped talking when she approached and started again when she left. Elsie heard it too. She came home from playing near the Veen claim one afternoon and asked why the Veen boys said her mother was building a house out of garbage. Ruth knelt in front of her daughter and held her by the shoulders. "What did you tell them?" she said. "I told them it is not garbage. It is bottles." "And what did they say?" "They said bottles are garbage." Ruth pulled Elsie close. Over the child's shoulder, she could see the trench cut into the dugout floor, the row of empty bottles waiting against the wall, the bucket of clay and ash mixed for filling. The evidence of her plan looked exactly like what the Veen boys described. "Sometimes," Ruth said, "the useful thing and the foolish thing look the same until winter comes." The first week of October, she stopped listening to what the settlement thought and began building the floor. She started at the sleeping area, the back corner of the dugout where the pallet lay, the section where she and Elsie spent the most hours pressed against the earth. She used a flat shovel to scrape the top 4 inches of packed clay into a bucket and hauled it outside. The work was harder than digging the grave. The dugout floor was not loose soil. It was clay that had been walked on, compressed by boots and water and time, and cutting it free took the edge off the shovel blade by the end of the first afternoon. Her back ached from working bent in a room where she could not stand fully upright near the walls. Her palms blistered at the base of each finger, where the shovel handle pressed and twisted. By the 3rd day, the blisters tore. The raw skin beneath them wept clear fluid that mixed with the clay and stung. She wrapped her hands in strips of flour sack and kept working because the calendar did not care about her hands. She dried the exposed subgrade by raking hot coals from the stove into a flat iron pan and setting it on the bare clay for hours at a time, rotating it to cover the full surface. The heat drove moisture upward in visible steam that fogged the dugout until she opened the door. She repeated this twice a day for 3 days. On the 4th day, the clay stopped darkening when she pressed her thumb into it. It was ready. Then she began laying bottles. Each bottle went on its side, corked end alternating direction with base end against the next bottle in the row, packed as tight as she could press them. The first row took 31 bottles. She ran her hand along them. The glass was cool, smooth, and utterly unlike the earth it rested on. Each bottle held its column of sealed, still air that would not move, would not circulate, would not carry the cold upward the way the packed clay did. She filled the gaps between bottles with dry clay mixed with ash from the stove. She worked the fill in with her fingers, pushing it into every crevice, making sure no bottle could roll or shift under weight. Her cracked hands bled into the fill, and the clay turned faintly pink in places, but she did not stop. The second row went faster. By the end of the first day, she had laid 68 bottles in a rectangle covering the sleeping area. By the 3rd day, she had 214 bottles buried in tight rows across a section roughly 6 feet by 8 feet, packed with clay ash fill, ready for the cap layer. She mixed the cap, clay, straw cut to finger-length ash, and a handful of sand from the creek bank in a wooden bucket, working it with a broken hoe handle until it held together when squeezed. Then she spread it over the bottle bed in thin layers, tamping each one with the flat of the shovel, building up 2 inches of compacted surface. She smoothed the top with a board. She stood and looked at what she had made. It looked like nothing. It looked like a patch of slightly different dirt in the corner of a room that was already made of dirt. It looked exactly like what the settlement believed it was, a widow's grief turned into a senseless project. But when she knelt and pressed her palm flat to the capped surface, the way Pryor had pressed his palm to the bare floor 5 weeks earlier, she felt something. Not warmth, not yet, but a difference, a hesitation, as though the earth's pull had to travel a longer road to reach her skin and arrive tired. It was not proof, but it was a floor, the first one she had ever built, and 2/3 of the room still lay bare. On October 6th, 3 days before the first frost, a night rain came through hard enough to send water seeping under the front wall and across the uncovered half of the floor. Ruth woke to wet clay under her elbow and a thin sheet of muddy water creeping toward the bottle bed she had spent 2 weeks building. She pulled Elsie onto the pallet and stuffed rags along the wall base, but the water found its way through the gaps in the planking and pooled against the first row of capped bottles. By morning, one corner of the cap layer had softened. The clay-straw mix, not yet fully cured, had absorbed the moisture and turned dark and spongy. Ruth pressed her thumb into it and felt it give. She cut the softened section away with the shovel and found the bottles beneath it intact, still dry, still holding their air. But the cap above them was ruined and would need to be remixed, relaid, and retamped. 3 days of work undone in one night of rain. She sat on the bucket by the stove and looked at the damage. Elsie was eating cold biscuit at the pallet. The morning light came through the open doorway and lit the wet floor like a mirror. Ruth picked up the shovel and began again. Tell us in the comments, have you ever kept building something while everyone around you treated it like proof you had lost your senses? The first frost came on October 9th. Ruth woke to ice in the water bucket and a rime of white across the grass outside the doorway. The sleeping area cap was repaired and holding. The rest of the floor, the walkway from door to stove, the area around the stove base, the threshold, remained raw earth. She had 180 bottles stockpiled outside the dugout, wrapped in sacking to prevent breakage. She needed at least 100 more to cover the remaining floor at the density she wanted. She needed more corks, more clay, more ash, more straw. She needed days, and the frost was telling her that the days had a number now, and the number was getting smaller. She looked at her hands. Both palms were cracked at every knuckle. The skin between her fingers had split from the cold clay and bled along the creases when she opened her fists. She wrapped them again in flour sack strips and picked up the shovel. October was burning, November was coming, and the floor was not half finished. She needed bottles, and she was running out of places to find them. The settlement saloon produced maybe 20 empties a week. The trash heaps along the wagon road had been picked through twice already. The mercantile had none. Kip sold goods in tins, barrels, and paper sacks, not glass. Ruth had walked the creek bank for 3 miles in each direction and collected every bottle the water had carried and lodged in the root tangles along the shore. She had asked at every claim within walking distance. Some women gave her what they had. Others looked at her the way they looked at weather, something happening that was not their concern. By mid-October, she had 394 bottles total, of which 214 were already buried under the sleeping area. That left 180 for the remaining 100-odd square feet. It was not enough. She needed them packed tight, necks alternating, no gaps wider than a finger. At the density the sleeping area demanded, she was short by at least 100 bottles, possibly more. The stove-side section was critical. That was where she stood to cook, where she knelt to feed the fire, where Elsie sat during the day because it was the warmest air in the room. If the cold came through the floor there, as hard as Pryor predicted, the stove would fight the ground and lose, because heat rises and the ground does not care about the air above it. She was kneeling at the edge of the excavated stove section on the afternoon of October 16th, measuring the trench depth with her hand, when a shadow blocked the doorway. The man standing there was tall, thin in the way old men get thin when they have worked with their hands for decades, and the work has filed everything away except bone and tendon. He had a white beard trimmed short and eyes the color of creek water in winter, pale, steady, and difficult to read. He wore a coat patched at both elbows and held a walking stick cut from ash. He did not speak. He looked past Ruth at the floor, at the trench, at the row of bottles lined against the wall, at the bucket of clay ash fill, at the cap layer in the sleeping corner, still faintly damp from the repair she had made after the rain. Then he looked at Ruth's hands, wrapped in stained flour sack strips, clay worked into every crease. "You are not warming the earth," he said. His voice carried an accent, Norwegian, the vowels round and the consonants clipped. "You are trying to stop it touching you." Ruth stood up. She did not know this man. "Jonas Halldorsen," he said. "I'm on the claim past the Veens, 2 miles. I have been there 11 years. Ruth called her. "I know who you are. Everyone knows who you are. The bottle woman." He said it without mockery. He said it the way a man identifies a species of bird, by its distinguishing feature. He walked into the dugout without being invited, which on the frontier was not rudeness but familiarity, and crouched at the edge of the sleeping area cap. He pressed his palm flat to the surface and held it for 10 seconds. Then he pressed his palm to the bare earth beside the trench. He held that for 10 seconds, too. "How did you know?" Ruth asked. "Know what?" "That I am trying to stop it touching me, not warm it." Halldorsen looked up at her. "Because I built root cellars in Norway before I came here. Stone footings with straw packed between. The straw does not warm anything. It only holds still air. Still air is slow. Slow is what you need between yourself and the ground." He stood. "Your father was a cellar man." It was not a question. "A cooper," Ruth said, "who built cellars on the side. And he used bottles. Along the shelf footings, where the frost came up worst." Halldorsen nodded once, as though she had passed an examination he had been giving silently since the doorway. "Your cap mix is wrong," he said. Ruth stiffened. She had spent 2 weeks developing that mix by trial and feel, adjusting the ratio of clay to straw to ash, until it held together when tamped and did not crack when it dried. The sleeping area cap had survived everything except the rain, and that failure was a drainage problem, not a mix problem. "It is too wet," Halldorsen said. "You are mixing it like mortar. It should be mixed like soil, damp enough to bind, dry enough to set hard in 2 days, not 5, and you need more ash. The ash makes it tight together tighter. It also draws moisture out as it cures." "I used what I had." "You have a stove. You have been burning wood for a month. You have ash. Not enough for the whole floor." Halldorsen reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out a handful of something white and powdery. He let it fall onto the cap layer. Lime. Not pure lime, crucite, the kind that could be burned from Limestone Creek rock if you had the patience and the fuel. "There is limestone along the creek bed a 1/4 mile south," he said. "Small pieces. Enough to burn in your stove if you pile them on the coals overnight. The powder you get mixes with clay and sets harder than anything straw alone can give you." "Why are you telling me this?" Halldorsen looked at her with an expression she had not seen since her father died. It was not pity. It was not charity. It was the look of a man who recognizes competence and cannot walk past it without offering what he knows. "Because you are not guessing," he said. "You understand why the bottles work. Most people would stuff rags under the bed and call it done. You dug a trench and laid glass in rows and packed the gaps. That is not desperation. That is thinking. and I have not seen thinking on this stretch of claims in 11 winters. He left. He came back the next morning with a sack of creek limestone and a wire brush. Over the next 10 days, Jonas Haldorsen appeared at Ruth's dugout every morning at first light and stayed until the sun dropped behind the western grass. He did not move in. He did not explain his help beyond what he had already said. He simply arrived, set down his tools, and worked. He taught her 3 things that changed the floor. The first was soil selection. Not all clay was equal. The sticky, wet clay near the surface held too much water and shrank as it dried, which cracked the cap. The firmer gray clay 2 inches deeper packed tighter, shed moisture faster, and bonded better with ash and lime. Halderson showed her how to test it by rolling a pinch between her fingers. If it stuck like paste, it was too wet. If it crumbled like sand, it was too dry. If it held its shape and then broke clean when she pressed harder, it was right. The second was load distribution. Ruth had been laying bottles in straight parallel rows, which meant every seam between rows ran in the same direction. Weight on the surface pressed directly down onto those seams, and the seams were the weakest point. Halderson showed her how to stagger the rows the way a bricklayer staggers courses. Each bottle offset half a length from the one in the row beside it, so the seams never lined up. The weight spread across many contact points instead of one fault line. "Step on the old section," he said. Ruth stepped onto the sleeping area cap. It held. "Now step on the stove section." She stepped. It held differently, firmer, the way a table feels different from a bench because the legs are placed better. The third was the cap itself. Halderson mixed a new batch in front of her. Clay, straw, ash, and the burned limestone powder he had shown her how to make. He added water sparingly, working the mix with his hands until it had the consistency of damp garden soil, not mud. He spread a thin layer over a test patch of bottles, tamped it with a flat board, and told Ruth to leave it for 2 days. When she checked on the 3rd morning, the surface was dry, pale gray, and hard enough that her thumbnail left only a faint scratch. The old mix had taken 5 days to cure and cracked at the edges. This one had set in too and held. "Teach me the lime burning," she said. "Tonight," he said. That night, while Elsie slept on the pallet in the finished corner, Ruth and Jonas fed limestone pieces into the stove alongside the firewood. The heat had to be sustained for hours. They took turns feeding the fire and talking in low voices so as not to wake the child. Haldorsen told her about building stone cellars in Bergen as a young quarryman, about the crossing to America in 1869, about his wife who had died of cholera in Yankton before they ever reached the claim. He told her these things without sentiment, the way a man describes the weather of a particular year. It happened. It was hard. The next season came. By morning, the limestone had calcined to a chalky white powder that crumbled between Ruth's fingers. She had enough to mix with the remaining cap material for the entire floor. The days fell into a rhythm built on diminishing time. Each morning, Ruth dug and Haldorsen tested. She excavated sections of the floor in order of priority. Stove-side walkway first, then the area beneath the table, then the threshold last because it was least critical for sleeping warmth but most exposed to incoming cold. He checked the subgrade for moisture, approved or rejected her drying work, and helped position the bottles. Elsie scraped labels and sorted bottles by size. She carried the smaller ones, ink bottles, medicine bottles. To her mother in groups of 4, holding them against her chest like kittens. She had stopped asking about the laughter at the settlement. She had started counting bottles the way other children counted days until Christmas. Progress markers accumulated. By October 22nd, the stove-side section was laid and capped. 131 bottles, staggered rows, lime-hardened cap. By October 28th, the table area was done. 73 bottles. The threshold section remained, and Ruth was short on glass. "How many do you need?" Haldorson asked. 60. Maybe 70. "I have some. Empty crocks, too, from the store. They hold air the same as glass." He brought 47 bottles and 9 stoneware crocks the next morning. Ruth did not ask where he had kept them or why he had them. On the frontier, what mattered was not the provenance of a resource, but the fact of it. On the 2nd of November, Enoch Pryor returned. He did not announce himself. He rode the mule onto the claim, tied it, and walked into the dugout where Ruth was tamping the final cap section near the doorway. Haldorson was outside, cutting straw. Elsie was inside, drawing in the dirt of the threshold gap where the clay had not yet been laid. Pryor stood in the center of the room. The floor beneath his boots was solid, capped, cured, pale gray with the lime clay mix, damp only at the threshold where the newest section was still setting. He looked at it for a long time. Then he stamped his boot. The sound was different. It was not the dull wet thud of September. It was firmer, harder, the sound of packed earth over a hidden structure like stamping on a bridge. "You buried something under here," he said. "Bottles." Bottles. 467 bottles and 9 crocks, corked, sealed, laid on their sides, packed with clay and ash, capped with lime-hardened clay and straw. Pryor looked at her as though she had told him she had buried gold coins. "And you think bottles under clay will stop what is coming? I think they will slow it." "Slow it." He crouched and laid his palm on the floor again, the same gesture he had made in September. He held it longer this time, his brow creased. "It is different," he said, "not a concession, an observation. The bottles hold dead air. The air breaks the contact between the earth and the surface. The cold still comes, but it has to work harder." Pryor stood. He looked at the sleeping corner, where the cap was oldest and hardest. He looked at the threshold, where it was newest and still curing. "If it holds till supper," he said, "I will give you that much." He walked out. At the doorway, he paused and looked at Haldorson, who had stopped cutting straw and was watching from the woodpile. "You helped her," Pryor said. "She did not need help. She needed lime." Pryor said nothing more. He mounted the mule and rode east toward the settlement. Ruth watched him go and felt something she had not felt in weeks. Not hope, exactly, but the absence of the weight that comes from working alone against a verdict that everyone has already delivered. By November 7th, the floor was complete. 467 bottles and 9 stoneware crocks lay buried beneath a cap of lime-hardened clay 2 to 3 inches thick across the entire dugout. 12 by 14 feet of improvised insulation, separating the room from the frozen earth below. Ruth lit the stove at dusk and began her tests. She set a cup of water on a crate near the ceiling and another on the floor edge near the threshold. She slept one night with her hand resting on the capped sleeping area, and the next with her hand on the bare dirt of the step outside the doorway. She marked where frost appeared first in the mornings, always on the metal hinge of the door, then on the water bucket, then on the threshold dirt, not on the capped floor. Not yet. The sleeping area dried more fully between sweepings. Elsie stopped waking in the night with leg cramps from cold feet. Condensation around the bed decreased. Ruth could not measure temperature, but she could measure the things that temperature caused, and the things she measured said the floor was different from the ground. Martha Veen came by on November 9th and stood on the cap for several minutes without speaking. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other. She crouched and touched the surface. "It feels different," she said. "Warmer is not the word. Less cold. Less cold is enough. First cold is nothing, Martha said. October cold is a joke the weather tells before the real one. January is the judge. I know. Enoch says the real test is when the frost drives deep and the stove cannot keep up, when the ground under this floor turns to stone. I know. Martha looked at her. I'm not saying you failed. I'm saying you have not been tested. That was fair. Ruth accepted it. The floor was finished, but the winter was not. Haldorson came by that evening. He did not test the floor or inspect the cap. He sat on the stool by the stove and drank coffee and said nothing for a long time. Then he crouched and pressed his palm flat to the sleeping area floor and held it there in silence. Ruth watched him. What are you listening for? Nothing, he said. I am listening for nothing. When you press your hand on bare earth in November, you can hear the cold. Not truly hear it, but you feel it pulling, and the pull has a sound in your mind, like water running under ice. When you press your hand here, he lifted his palm. The sound is quieter, the pull is slower. He stood. November is not the test, he said, but the floor is ready to be tested. The sky changed on November 11th. Ruth had been watching it for days, the way the light flattened in the afternoons, the way the wind shifted from the southwest to the north and stayed there, the way the grass lay down as though pressed by a hand. The clouds that came in were not the high white clouds of autumn. They were low, gray, dense, the color of iron, and they moved fast across the sky in a way that made the ground beneath them feel small. On November 14th, the temperature fell off a cliff. Ruth woke at dawn, and the air inside the dugout bit her face. The stove had burned down to coals in the night. She had fed it at midnight, but the wood she had added was green cottonwood that burned slow and cool, not the dry oak she was rationing for the worst nights. She threw kindling on the coals and blew until flame caught. The draft pulled weak. The pipe made a sound like breathing through a wet cloth. She opened the door to check the sky, and the cold hit her like a wall, not the gradual cool of autumn mornings, a physical force. The air outside was different from the air she had been breathing all season, heavier, sharper, carrying a metallic taste that settled on her tongue like a coin. The water bucket had frozen solid, not a skin of ice on the surface, solid, from rim to base. She looked at the thermometer Kip had given her, a simple mercury tube nailed to the inside of the door frame. The mercury had dropped below the lowest mark. She did not know the number. She did not need to. The bucket told her everything. By noon, the wind was screaming. It came from the northwest in gusts that shook the sod wall and drove snow horizontally past the doorway gap, in sheets so thick she could not see the woodpile 10 feet away. The temperature was still falling. She could feel it in the walls, which were losing their stored warmth. She could feel it in the ceiling, where the packed earth roof was transmitting cold downward for the first time since she had arrived, and she could feel the floor. She knelt in the center of the room and pressed both palms down. The capped surface was cool, not warm, but cool the way a cellar is cool, steady, slow, without the killing bite of exposed earth. She crawled to the threshold, where the cap was thinnest and newest, and pressed her palms there. Colder, noticeably colder, but not the ice-stone feeling of bare ground in a freeze. Then she pressed her hand to the dirt step outside the dugout entrance. The cold went through her palm and into the bones of her hand so fast she pulled away as though she had touched the stove. The difference was real. The floor was working. But the storm was just beginning. Elsie began coughing that afternoon. By evening, the cough had a bark to it that Ruth recognized, the sound a chest makes when the cold has gotten into the lungs and the body is fighting to keep the airways warm. The child's forehead was hot. Her cheeks were flushed. She lay on the pallet in the sleeping corner and shivered under every blanket Ruth owned. Ruth fed the stove until the iron glowed. She boiled water for steam. She rubbed Elsie's chest with tallow and wrapped her in a wool shawl that smelled of lanolin and wood smoke. The child slept in fits, waking to cough, then drifting under again. At 9 o'clock, the stovepipe clogged. The draft, already weak from the wind direction, failed completely. Smoke backed into the room in a gray cloud that burned Ruth's eyes and sent her to the floor, gasping. She pulled Elsie off the pallet and held her low where the air was clearest. The smoke pooled against the ceiling and thickened. She had to fix the pipe. She had to fix it now, in the dark, in the wind, with her daughter fevered and the temperature outside the door capable of killing exposed skin in minutes. Halderson had shown her a trick 3 weeks earlier. A wire, stove wire, stiff and long, threaded up through the pipe joint and worked back and forth to break the crust of soot and ash that built up where the draft was poor. She had laughed when he demonstrated it, because it seemed so simple. She was not laughing now. She found the wire by feel in the dark, because the smoke was too thick to see the corner where she kept the tools. She found the pipe joint by touch, loosened the collar with a rag-wrapped hand because the metal was still hot, and fed the wire upward. The crust resisted. She pushed harder, twisted, felt it crack and break and fall in chunks that rattled down into the stove box. Smoke surged once, thick and black, and then the draft caught. The pipe began to draw. The smoke thinned. The flame in the stove box roared up as air rushed through the cleared channel. Ruth sat on the floor with soot on her face and her hands shaking. Elsie was still on the ground beside her, coughing but breathing. The air in the room was clearing. The stove was burning again. She lifted Elsie back onto the pallet and pressed her hand to the sleeping area floor beneath the blankets. Cool, steady. The floor was holding. Outside, the world was dying. She could hear it through the walls, the wind carrying sounds that were not wind, a cracking somewhere east that could have been a tree or a fence post or a roof beam giving way under the weight of driven snow, a low moan that might have been cattle caught in the open, pushed against a drift fence with no shelter and no instinct left except to turn their backs to the wind and wait. Somewhere, she knew, people were doing the same thing. The claims east and west of hers were occupied by families who had built sod houses, log starts, shanties, and dugouts of every quality. Some had plank floors, some had earth floors. None of them had what she had. She thought about the freighter Pryor had mentioned, the kind of man who hauled supplies through weather like this because delay meant starvation at the other end. She thought about the homesteader 4 miles north who had not finished his roof before October and was living under canvas weighted with stones. She thought about all the ground in the territory that was freezing right now, driving frost down through clay and loam and sand, turning the earth itself into a weapon against every body pressed against it. Her floor held its still air in the dark beneath her daughter, and she could not be certain even now that it would be enough. At 11 o'clock, someone pounded on the door. Peter Vane stood in the wind with snow caked on his eyebrows and his coat front. He was shouting, but the wind tore the words apart before they reached her. Ruth pulled him inside and forced the door closed against a gust that nearly tore it from the leather hinges. "The baby," he said. "Martha cannot warm the baby. The floor is ice. The boards are frozen from beneath, and the stove cannot reach them. The baby will not stop crying." The Veen cabin had a plank floor, proper pine boards on joists, the kind Pryor had prescribed, the kind Ruth could not afford. But plank floors over shallow crawl spaces froze too when the ground beneath them turned to stone. The thin air gap under the boards was not enough to stop the kind of cold that was falling on the territory tonight. The boards became conductors, not insulators, and the baby 3 months old, unable to move, unable to generate its own heat through labor, was losing warmth through the floor it lay on. Ruth looked at Elsie on the pallet. She looked at Pater, whose face was the color of ash. "Bring them here," she said. Pater ran. He disappeared into the white wall of wind outside the door and was gone. Ruth counted the minutes. She fed the stove. She checked Elsie's forehead, still hot, but the child was sleeping. She boiled water and set it near the pallet so the steam would keep the air moist around the child's chest. 20 minutes later, Pater was back with Martha and the baby wrapped in every cloth the Veen household owned. Martha's face was rigid with cold, and something worse than cold, the look of a woman who has carried her child through a storm and is not yet certain she carried it in time. The baby had stopped crying, which was worse than crying, because silence in an infant in a freeze meant the body was conserving what little heat it had left, and that was a race the body would lose. Ruth took the baby. The child weighed almost nothing through the wrapping. She could feel the cold stored in the blankets, the sharp chill of outdoor air trapped in the cloth. She laid the baby on the pallet beside Elsie, on the bottle floor, in the sleeping corner where the cap was oldest and hardest, and the trapped air beneath had been sealed since October. She piled blankets on top and tucked the edges under so no draft could reach the child. She pushed the pallet closer to the stove until the heat from the iron was a physical presence against her own face. Martha crouched beside it and pressed her hands to the floor. "It is warm," she said. The word was wrong. It was not warm. It was less cold. But in that moment, with her baby turning blue on a plank floor that had failed, less cold felt like a furnace. 4 bodies in the dugout now, 1 stove, 1 unproven floor, and the storm outside still building. If you are invested in this story, stay with it, because the next few minutes decide whether that dugout was shelter or a grave. The worst hour came at 3 in the morning. Ruth had not slept. She had fed the stove every 40 minutes, burning through her dry oak reserve faster than she had planned. The wind had not decreased. If anything, it had found new angles, gusts that struck the front wall and shoved cold air through the plank gaps she had caulked with mud. Gaps that had held in October but were cracking now as the mud froze and shrank. The temperature outside was so far below zero that the concept had lost its meaning. It was cold the way deep water is deep, a condition, not a measurement. At 3:15, she heard a sound from the threshold section of the floor. A crack. Muted, short, like a knuckle popping. She froze. She stared at the threshold cap, where the newest layer of lime clay had been in place for less than 2 weeks. In the stove light, she could see a line, thin, dark, running across the cap surface from the door frame to the first row of staggered bottles beneath. The cap was cracking. The frost had driven deep enough to reach the subgrade beneath the bottles, and the expansion was pushing upward through the weakest point, the threshold, where the cap was thinnest, the ceiling poorest, and the exposure to outside air greatest. Ruth's chest tightened. If the crack widened, it could open a channel for frost to work directly through the bottle layer. If moisture seeped in from the frozen threshold dirt and reached the bottles, the trapped air would be displaced by water that would freeze and expand and crack the glass. One failure could cascade. The whole floor could compromise from the edge inward. She grabbed a rag and the last of the lime clay mix she had kept in a covered bucket by the stove. She crawled to the threshold. The crack was narrow, the width of a straw. She packed the lime clay into it with her fingers, pressing hard, smoothing the surface. She layered a second application on top and tamped it with the flat of her hand. Then she dragged the last feed sack she had and laid it across the threshold section as extra cover. The crack did not widen, the repair held. The stove kept burning, the floor kept working. At dawn, she checked the room. Elsie's fever had broken sometime in the night. The child was asleep on the pallet, breathing evenly, her color better. The Veen baby was awake and moving its hands. Martha was asleep, sitting up against the wall with her chin on her chest. Peter was on the floor beside the stove, his coat balled under his head. Ruth pressed her palm to the sleeping area floor. Cool. Steady. Dry. She pressed her palm to the threshold cap under the veed sack. Colder. Firmer. But holding. She crawled to the doorway and pressed her hand to the bare earth of the step outside. The cold went through her hand like a nail. The difference was not theory. It was not memory. It was not hope. It was the space between a body that survived the night and a body that did not. The bottles beneath the floor had held their pockets of dead air through the worst freeze the territory had seen in years. The trapped air had not stopped the cold. Nothing stopped the cold, but it had slowed it enough that one stove in one room had been enough to keep 4 people alive. Haldorsen arrived at first light. He did not knock. He opened the door and stood there with frost in his beard and his breath making clouds in the gray morning air. He looked at the 4 people in the room. He looked at the floor. He crouched and laid his palm flat on the cap near the sleeping area. He was quiet for a long time. "The floor held," Ruth said. "I know," he said. "I can feel it." He stood, walked to the threshold, examined the crack repair, pressed the feed sack down more firmly, and nodded once. "The threshold will need reinforcing before the next one," he said. "More lime, thicker cap, maybe a board on top to distribute the load." "Is there going to be a next one?" Haldorsen looked at her. Outside, the wind was still keening across the grass, and the snow lay in drifts against the sod wall like something the land had piled there to bury them. "This is the hard winter," he said. "There will be many next ones." He chopped frozen clay from the threshold edge, helped Ruth repack the seam, and reinforced the doorway section with a plank scavenged from the woodpile. Martha woke and watched him work. Peter took the baby and stood near the stove, rocking the child, saying nothing. By noon the wind had died. The sky was blue and hard as enamel. The temperature had not risen. But the storm had passed, and the dugout was still standing, and the floor beneath it still held its secret. 467 bottles and 9 crocks, invisible beneath the clay, each one holding its small portion of still air in the dark. Ruth sat on the pallet beside Elsie and looked at the room, at the stove, at the floor, at the people who had come to her for shelter because the thing the settlement had laughed at was the thing that worked when proper lumber failed. She thought of Pryor's words. "You will wake beside a body." She had not woken beside a body. She had woken beside her daughter, alive, breathing, warm enough. The question was no longer whether the floor could survive a night. The question was whether it could survive a winter. And beyond that, whether anyone besides Ruth would believe what the cold had just proved. The storm passed. The winter did not. Within 2 days, word of what had happened in Ruth Calder's dugout moved through the settlement the way all information moved on the plains, carried by people who had been there or knew someone who had. Peter Vane told it at the mercantile. Martha told it at the water pump. And by the end of the week, the story had taken the shape that stories take when they travel through a community that does not want to believe them but cannot find a reason not to. The widow's trash floor had held. The plank floor had not. The baby that nearly died was carried to safety on a bed of buried bottles. Enoch Pryor came back on the 3rd day after the storm. He came alone, on the mule, in the late morning when the sun was high enough to soften the top crust of snow, but not warm enough to reach the frozen ground beneath. He tied the mule and stood outside the dugout for a full minute before entering. Ruth was inside, replacing the threshold cap section she had patched during the crisis with a proper repair, fresh lime clay, thicker than before, pressed into the crack line and tamped smooth. Pryor ducked through the doorway. He did not speak. He walked to the center of the room and stood there, then moved to the sleeping corner and stood there. He knelt. He pressed his palm to the floor and held it for a long time, longer than he had in September, longer than he had in November. His face was unreadable. "The Veen baby," he said, "alive. Martha took her home yesterday. Pater patched the crawl space under their floor with straw bales. Straw bales will rot. I know. Martha knows too. She asked me to show her the bottles." Pryor kept his hand on the floor. His jaw worked, the way it does when a man is chewing on words he does not want to release. "I told you dirt would take the girl," he said. "I was wrong. You made the dirt let go." He stood. His knees cracked the same way they had in September. Everything about Pryor cracked, his joints, his voice, his certainty. But the words he had just spoken did not crack. They landed solid. Ruth did not thank him. Thanking a man for admitting error made the admission smaller. She nodded, and he nodded, and the exchange was complete. "Show me how it is laid," he said. She showed him. She pulled back the edge of the sleeping area cap where it met the wall, a section she had left accessible for inspection, and exposed the top row of bottles. Green, brown, clear, packed neck to base, sealed with clay ash fill, the glass surfaces dry and clean beneath the cap. Pryor crouched and looked at them the way he had looked at the floor in September, with calculation, not emotion. "How many?" 467 bottles, 9 crocks. "And the air inside them does the work." "The air inside them does not move. The cold has to pass through the glass, then through the still air, then through the glass again, then through the fill, then through the cap. Each layer slows it. By the time it reaches the surface, the stove has already replaced what was lost." Pryor stood and walked the perimeter of the room, the same walk he had taken in September. His boots made a different sound this time, not the dull, wet thud of bare earth. A firmer note, harder, with a faint resonance beneath it that only a man who had walked 1,000 floors and 1,000 shelters would notice. "The Veen cabin has a plank floor," he said. "Sawn pine, joists, air gap beneath, everything I told you to build." "I know. It froze from beneath. The baby nearly died on a proper floor." "I know that too." "Your floor held." He said it flat, the way a man states the weight of a loaded wagon. Not praise, measurement. "The planks sit on joist with an open air gap," Ruth said. "The air in that gap moves. Wind gets under the sill, circulates through the crawl space, carries cold across the underside of every board. The boards conduct it straight through. A plank floor over a ventilated crawl space in a Dakota winter is a chimney running the wrong direction." Pryor looked at her. "You worked that out." "I worked it out the night Martha brought the baby. I had time to think while the stove burned and the floor held and I could not sleep." "Your father taught you this." "My father showed me bottles in a cellar. I built the rest." Pryor pulled his hat off, rubbed the back of his neck the same way he had in September, and put it back on. At the doorway, he paused and said, without turning, "I will tell the families east of the creek." It was not an apology. It was better. It was an endorsement from the man whose word carried the most weight in the territory, and he was offering to carry it himself. Martha Veen came the next day with a different face than the one Ruth had seen during the storm. The fear was gone. In its place was something Ruth recognized from the mercantile, from the women at the pump, from every frontier interaction where one person needed something another person had, the look of practical inquiry. "Show me," Martha said. Ruth showed her everything. They started outside, where Ruth had laid a demonstration patch, 12 bottles in staggered rows, packed with fill, capped with the lime clay mix. Martha knelt and pressed her hand to the cap, then to the bare ground beside it. "I can feel the difference," Martha said, "even now, in daylight with the sun on it. The sun warms the surface, the difference is underneath. At night, the bare ground loses everything. The cap over the bottles holds longer." "How long did it take you?" 4 weeks for the whole floor. But I was learning. If someone showed me from the start, I could do it in 2 weeks. 3 if the weather fought me. Martha looked at the demonstration patch. "I want to do the bed corner first, where the baby sleeps. That is where I started. How many bottles?" "For a corner, maybe 80, corked or plugged. You need dry fill, clay mixed with ash, not wet mud. And the cap has to be lime hardened or it will crack in the freeze." "I do not have lime." "You have limestone along the creek, same as I did. Burn it in the stove overnight, small pieces, piled on the coals. By morning, you will have powder. Mix it with the clay and straw and cap wet. It cures in 2 days." Ruth walked Martha through each step. She showed her how to test the clay by rolling it between her fingers. She showed her how to stagger the bottles so the seams never lined up. She showed her how to alternate necks and bases and how to fill the gaps with dry mix pressed tight by hand, not shoveled loose. She showed her how to tamp the cap in thin layers, not one thick pour, because thick layers cracked from the inside out as they dried. Martha watched with the focus of a woman who had nearly lost a child and would not lose another. She asked questions, precise questions, practical questions, the kind that come from a mind that has stopped doubting and started planning. What if a bottle breaks under weight? It will not break if the fill is packed tight around it. The fill distributes the load. But if one does crack, the ones beside it still hold their air. One failure does not collapse the row. What about rats? Rats dig. They do not dig through packed clay and ash over glass. They dig through loose earth. If the fill is tight and the cap is hard, they go around. Martha nodded. She gathered her coat. At the doorway, she turned and looked at Ruth. "I said you would cut the child's feet and bury your money in nonsense," Martha said. "I was wrong about the nonsense. I was right that glass can cut, so make sure your girl wears shoes." It was the closest Martha Veen would ever come to humor about the matter. Ruth took it as a gift. Over the next week, 3 more people came. A bachelor homesteader named Torsten Lunde from the claims north of the creek brought 60 bottles in a grain sack and asked Ruth to walk his dugout floor and tell him where to start. His place was smaller than hers, 10 by 12, and drier because it sat higher on the slope. She told him to dig 4 inches, dry the subgrade, and lay the sleeping area first. She stayed 2 hours and helped him place the first 3 rows. A woman named Birgit Haugen, whose husband was freighting and would not return until spring, came with her 2 children and asked if the method worked for a sod house with a partial plank floor. Ruth told her to pull the planks in the sleeping corner, lay bottles on the exposed earth beneath, and replace the planks on top. The air gap under the planks, plus the bottle layer below, would give her 2 insulating barriers instead of 1. An old man named Kip, not Aldous from the mercantile, but his father, who lived in a back room and had not spoken to Ruth before, came to the dugout one afternoon and stood on the floor without being invited. He stamped his foot once. He grunted. He left. The next day, Aldous told Ruth that his father wanted to know if bottles would keep a keg of cider from freezing in the store cellar. Word spread the way water spreads through cloth, slowly following the paths of least resistance, darkening the fabric in patterns that could not be predicted. Ruth did not advertise. She did not visit claims uninvited. She waited, and people came, and she showed them what she knew. The one person who did not come was Silas Brame. He heard about the storm. He heard about the Veen baby. He heard about Pryor's visit. And what Brame heard made him angry, not because Ruth had survived. Survival did not threaten his business, but because survival made her claim valuable. A widow who could winter in a dugout was a widow who would not sell, and a widow who would not sell was a claim Brame could not buy. He tested the ground 2 weeks after the storm. He sent Fisher, the cattle hand, to Ruth's dugout with an offer: $40 for the claim, paid in cash, enough to buy passage east and start again somewhere warm. Ruth was outside splitting kindling when Fisher arrived. She listened to the offer. She set the hatchet on the chopping block. "Tell Brame I would not sell this claim for $400, she said. "And if he sends another man to my door with a price, I will tell Pryor. And Pryor will tell everyone between here and Yankton what kind of man buys widow's land during a freeze." Fisher left. He did not come back. But Brame was not finished. Men like Brame were never finished. They simply waited for the next angle. Through December, the winter deepened, and the bottle floor proved itself in the slow, undramatic way that real innovation proves itself, not through spectacle, but through accumulation. Each morning, Ruth checked the floor. Each morning, the sleeping area was dry, the cap firm, the surface cool, but not frozen. Each morning, the threshold section, patched, reinforced, covered with a plank, held its repair. The stove consumed wood at a rate she could sustain because it fought only the air, not the ground. Halderson came every few days. Their work shifted from construction to refinement. He showed her how to double the bottle layer beneath the bed by adding a second course of smaller bottles, medicine bottles, ink bottles, in the gaps between the first course. The double layer slowed the cold further. The sleeping area, which had been cool to the touch in November, was now merely neutral, neither warm nor cold, simply there, like the surface of a table that had been in a heated room for hours. They fell into a rhythm of collaboration that neither of them named but both recognized. Ruth did the heavy work, digging, hauling, mixing. Halderson did the precision work, testing the cap hardness with his thumbnail, checking the bottle rows for gaps that might shift under load, measuring the lime powder by feel rather than by weight because feel, he said, was more honest than a scale. He told her more about Norway during these sessions, about the stone quarry in Bergen where he had learned to read the grain of rock the way other men read the weather, about his wife, Solveig, who had survived the crossing and the first year in Yankton and the loneliness of a claim where the nearest woman spoke no Norwegian, only to die of cholera in the summer of '71 before the house was finished. He told Ruth this while packing lime clay into a crack near the stove base, his hands moving with a gentleness that seemed wrong for their size. "She would have understood your floor," he said. "She understood cold. She grew up where the fjord froze, and she knew that the danger was not in what you could see, but in what you could not. The frost beneath the stones, the ice in the well rope, the cold in the bed when the fire went down." "You built her a bottle floor," Ruth said. "I built her a stone floor, quarried slabs with straw packed between. It was the same principle, different material." "Did it work?" "She died before the first winter in the house. I never tested it with her sleeping on it." He said nothing more about Solveig. Ruth did not ask. Some doors on the frontier were closed for reasons that had nothing to do with weather. They worked together on improvements through December and into January. A raised cradle block, a short section of split log set on the cap to support the stove legs, distributing the weight so the heavy iron did not point load the bottles beneath. A stone runner along the traffic lane from door to stove, laid on top of the cap to protect the surface where boots wore it thin. An ash-rich leveling compound for the damp corner near the front wall where seepage still crept in during thaw days. One afternoon in mid-January, Haldorson arrived with a gift, a set of crude wooden forms, two boards hinged together with a leather strip for shaping cap layer bricks. Instead of spreading the lime clay mix loose and tamping it in place, Ruth could pack it into the form, press it flat, and lay the bricks side by side like tiles. The joints between bricks were weaker than a monolithic cap, but the bricks themselves were stronger, and they could be made near the stove where the heat cured them faster. "For the next person you teach," Haldorson said, "not everyone has your patience for tamping." These were small things, but small things accumulated were the difference between a shelter that survived one crisis and a shelter that survived a season. It was during one of these working sessions in late December that Ruth and Haldorson disagreed for the first time. She wanted to extend the bottle layer outside the dugout, to lay a band of insulation along the exterior wall base, buried in the earth, to slow the frost from reaching the foundation sod. The logic was sound. If the cold could be slowed before it entered the wall would hold its warmth longer, and the stove would fight less. Haldorson said no. "The bottles work because they are sealed," he said. "Inside, under a cap, protected from water and weight and the freeze-thaw cycle. Outside, buried in open ground, the frost will crack them. Water will fill them. They will become ice blocks, not air traps. And ice conducts cold faster than clay. Not if I pack them deep enough. Deep enough is 4 feet on this ground. You cannot dig 4 feet along a wall base in frozen earth with a flat shovel. I can try. You can try and fail and use 60 bottles that should be inside, keeping your daughter warm. Ruth." He said her name with the weight of a man who does not use names lightly. The floor works because it is contained. The moment you try to make it do more than it was built to do, it becomes a weakness, not a strength. Ruth wanted to argue. She had spent 3 months fighting limitations, money, time, materials, the opinions of everyone around her, and she had won every fight by pushing past the boundary other people drew. But Haldorson was not other people. He was the man who had taught her lime burning and staggered rows, and the difference between good clay and bad clay. His boundaries came from knowledge, not doubt. She did not extend the bottles outside. She hated the decision, but she made it, and it was the right one. And later, when the January thaws came and the exterior ground heaved and cracked and shifted in ways that would have destroyed any buried glass, she understood why. Through January, the hard winter earned its name. Storm after storm rolled across the territory. The railroad was blocked for weeks. Freight stopped. The settlement ran low on flour, kerosene, and patience. Families burned hay, then twisted hay into sticks, then furniture, then fence posts. The cold was not a single event. It was a condition, a state of being that redefined what normal meant and made every previous winter seem like autumn. Haldorson weakened in late January. He came to the dugout less often. When he came, he sat more than he worked. His cough, which Ruth had first noticed in December as a dry catch at the end of his sentences, had deepened into something wet and persistent. He did not complain. He did not mention it. But Ruth could hear the effort in his breathing when he crouched to inspect the floor, and she could see the way he braced his hand against the wall when he stood, as though the act of rising had become a negotiation with his body. On February 2nd, he came for the last time that winter. He sat on the stool by the stove and held a cup of coffee in both hands. Elsie was asleep on the pallet. The dugout was warm, not hot, not comfortable in any way a person from a frame house would recognize, but warm enough that the water in the bucket was liquid and the breath in the air was invisible. "The floor's holding," Ruth said. "The floor will hold," Haldorson said. "It was always going to hold. You built it right." "You built it right. I laid bottles in dirt." "You laid bottles in dirt with a reason. That is building." He was quiet for a while. The stove ticked as the iron expanded. Outside, the wind moved snow across the claim in low rivers of white. Teach the part they cannot see, Haldorson said. Anyone can copy bottles in a trench. They can watch you do it and repeat the motions. But the part that matters, why still air works, why the cap must be dry, why the rows must stagger, why you cannot extend it past its purpose, that part lives in the understanding, not the hands. If you teach only the hands, the first person who tries it in different soil or with different bottles will fail and blame the method. If you teach the understanding, they will adjust. They will think. They will build floors you never imagined, in places you never saw, for problems you never faced. Ruth looked at him. His face was thinner than it had been in October. The bones of his cheeks stood out above the white beard. "You are telling me this because you think you are leaving," she said. "I'm telling you this because I am 61 and I have a cough that will not stop and the winter is not over." He finished the coffee, set the cup on the stool, and walked out. He did not look back. Ruth watched him cross the snow toward his claim, his walking stick punching holes in the crust, his shoulders narrower than she remembered. Haldorson died on the 9th of March in his own dugout, alone. A neighbor found him on the pallet with his coat folded under his head and his boots placed neatly by the door, as though he had prepared for a journey and then decided not to take it. The chest illness had filled his lungs with fluid over weeks, and the winter had taken what remained of a body that had already given most of itself to quarries, crossings, claims, and other people's floors. Ruth stood at his grave, another hole in frozen ground, another body lowered with rope, the second she had watched go into Dakota earth in 7 months, and did not speak. Elsie held her hand. The wind blew from the northwest, the direction it always blew, carrying snow off the open grass in thin white streams that looked like smoke from a fire no one had lit. 4 neighbors stood at the grave. Pryor was one of them. He said nothing either. The grave was shallow because the frost still held the ground at depth. They piled stones on top because the earth alone would not keep what the plains would send: coyotes, meltwater, the settling that comes when frozen ground finally thaws. Ruth placed the last stone herself. It was heavy and cold in her hands, and it felt like closing a book she had not finished reading. She walked home across the snow. The dugout was warm when she entered, warm in the way only her dugout was warm, with the stove burning and the floor holding its still air beneath the cap, and the bottles in the dark doing their work without sound or credit. She pressed her palm to the floor and held it there, the way Haldorson had done on his last visit, listening for the nothing that meant the cold was slow. The floor was his and hers together. Now it was hers alone. 3 weeks after Haldorson's death, the secondary crisis came. A family named Solheim, Niels and Ragna Solheim, with a newborn son born in January, Darn, lived 2 miles east on a claim that had been started late and finished poorly. Their dugout was smaller than Ruth's, shallower, and cut into softer ground that shifted in the freeze-thaw cycles. In late March, a warm day followed by a hard night freeze caused the roof to sag, the front wall to crack, and the floor to heave upward in a ridge that split the room nearly in half. Water from snow melt had seeped under the wall and frozen in the subgrade, lifting the earth like bread rising. The family was trapped in a shelter that was tearing itself apart. Peter Vane brought the news. He rode to Ruth's claim at a gallop and said that Niels was trying to shore the roof with fence poles, while Ragna held the baby in the one corner that had not shifted. Ruth went. She walked the 2 miles in wind that cut through her coat and found exactly what Peter had described: a dugout coming apart at the seams, a man working with a desperation that made his hands shake, a woman crouched in a corner with a newborn pressed against her chest and her eyes wide with the particular terror of a mother who cannot protect her child by any means she knows. Ruth looked at the floor. The heaved ridge ran diagonally across the room, lifting the earth 6 inches in a frozen mound that would not settle until deep thaw. The sleeping area was on the wrong side of the ridge, the side where the wall had cracked, where cold air poured in through the gap, where the earth was exposed and frozen solid. She knelt and pressed her hand to the sleeping area. The cold went through her palm immediately. This was not the slow pull of September earth in Ruth's dugout. This was January ground, frozen 3 feet deep, conducting cold upward with the efficiency of a metal rod. The baby was wrapped in everything the Solheims owned and was still losing. She did not have 400 bottles. She did not have 4 weeks. She did not have Haldorsen. She had 63 bottles she had brought in a sack. She had a bucket of lime clay mix. She had the knowledge of where to start and what to protect first. And she had a voice in her head that sounded like a 61-year-old Norwegian quarryman saying, "Protect the sleep zone first." "We are not fixing the whole floor," she told Niels. "We are fixing the sleeping corner, 4 feet by 6 feet. That is where the baby lies. Everything else waits." Niels Solheim was a large man with hands made for gripping plows, not for argument. He looked at Ruth, this widow with cracked hands and a sack of bottles, and did not argue. His wife had told him about the Calder floor. Half the territory had told him. "Tell me what to do," he said. "Dig, 4 inches, just the corner." They dug together. The frozen earth fought them at every inch. Ruth used a hatchet to break the crust, swinging it into the clay the way she had seen Haldorsen swing his walking stick against creek bank limestone. Short, angled blows that cracked the surface without shattering it. Niels followed with a flat shovel, scraping the loosened clay into a bucket. The work took 2 hours for a patch of floor that Ruth could have dug in 30 minutes in soft October ground. She dried the subgrade with coals from the Solheim stove, which was barely drawing in the damaged room. The coals hissed against the frozen clay and sent up thin columns of steam that smelled like the inside of a kiln. She rotated the pan 3 times and tested the surface with her thumb. Still damp. She rotated again. The 4th time, the clay held firm under pressure. Good enough. Not perfect. Haldorsen would have insisted on 2 more rounds, but Haldorsen was dead, and the baby was cold, and good enough was what she had. She laid bottles. 63 bottles in staggered rows, necks alternating, gaps filled with the lime clay she had carried 2 miles in a bucket balanced on her hip. She worked with her bare hands because gloves slowed the packing, and she needed to feel the gaps. The cold in the clay bit her fingers until they went numb, and then she worked by sight instead of touch. She capped the bed with the last of her mix, tamped it with the flat of the hatchet because she had not brought a board, and told Ragna to keep the baby on that corner and nowhere else until the cap cured. The cap would take 2 days to cure. The stove would need to burn hot to speed it. The rest of the floor was beyond saving until spring, but the corner, that one corner, 4 by 6 feet, 63 bottles deep, was enough. It was not elegant. It was not the full room insulation she had built in her own dugout over 4 weeks with Haldorsen beside her. It was a patch, a triage, a choice made with fewer bottles and worse soil, and no mentor to check her rows. But it was the choice Haldorsen had taught her to make. Protect the sleep zone first. Dry the fill before you rush. Distribute the load before you worry about appearance. Do the thing that keeps the body alive and let everything else wait. If this story reminds you that preparation is often invisible until the worst night arrives, share it with someone who would understand. Ragna Solheim's baby survived the last weeks of winter on that patch of 63 bottles. The corner held. The cap cured. The sleeping area stayed dry while the rest of the floor heaved and cracked around it like a frozen sea. And Ruth walked home across the thawing plains with empty hands and a full understanding of what Haldorsen had meant. Anyone can copy bottles, few understand the cold. She understood it, and she was the one who was left to teach it. Brame heard about the Solheim repair. He heard about it from Fisher, who had heard it from Peter Wien, who had been there when Ruth arrived with her sack of bottles and her hatchet and her certainty. Brame stood behind his bar and listened and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "She is building a reputation on rubbish. Reputations built on rubbish collapse." But his voice had changed. The certainty was gone from it. In its place was something Ruth would have recognized if she had heard it. The sound of a man who has bet on an outcome that is not arriving. The winter was ending, spring was coming, and Ruth Calder was still on her claim, with her daughter, with her floor, with the knowledge that the ground could be beaten by the things other people threw away. The question now was not whether she could survive. The question was what she would build next. Spring came to the Dakota Territory the way it always came, not as a gift, but as a negotiation. The snow melted in stages, revealing ground that was not the same ground it had been in October. The frost heaved and settled. Wagon ruts filled with meltwater and froze again at night and melted again by noon. The creek ran high and brown with sediment. The grass, when it finally showed, was pale and flat, pressed to the earth by months of wait. Ruth's dugout survived the thaw. The bottle floor, which had been tested by cold, now had to endure moisture from above as the snow on the roof melted and seeped through the brush and earth ceiling. She patched the drips with clay and directed the worst of the runoff away from the cap surface with a shallow trench cut along the wall base, a channel she lined with flat stones from the creek that carried the water to a hole by the doorway where it could drain outside. The floor held. The cap held. The bottles beneath, sealed in their clay ash beds, remained dry and intact. When she pried up a corner section to inspect in April, the glass was clean, the corks firm, the trapped air undisturbed. The floor had done its work for 5 months without failure, without maintenance beyond the threshold patch, without a single bottle cracking under the weight of 4 people on the worst night of the worst winter the territory had recorded. By May, Ruth Calder was no longer the bottle woman. She was the woman who knew about floors. The distinction mattered. The first name was a joke. The second was a title, earned the way all frontier titles were earned by doing the thing no one believed could be done and then doing it again for someone else. Through the spring and summer of 1881, Ruth taught. Not in a schoolroom, not from a book. She taught the way her father had taught her and Haldorsen had taught her, by showing, by doing, by walking someone else's floor and telling them where the cold would find them. She visited Martha Wien's claim and helped her extend the bed corner patch to cover the full sleeping area. 87 bottles, staggered, lime-capped, cured in 3 days under the summer heat. Martha's husband, Peter, watched Ruth work and said nothing, but when she left, he dug a trench for the root cellar and lined it with bottles he had been saving since February. She walked Torsten Lundi's dugout a second time and showed him how to double-layer the section beneath his bed, using the small medicine bottles as a second course. The double layer was Haldorsen's improvement, and Ruth taught it the way Jonas had taught her, by laying one course, pressing her hand to it, then laying the second and pressing again. "Feel the difference," she said. Lund felt. He nodded. He did not need an explanation. The hand told the truth. She visited Birgit Hogan and found that Birgit had not only laid bottles beneath her planks, but had taught her eldest daughter how to mix the cap. The daughter was 12 and had made her own brick forms from scrap wood, smaller than the ones Haldorsen had built, sized for a child's hands. "She does not know why it works," Birgit said. "She just knows how." Then I will teach her why, Ruth said. The how is the hands. The why is the part that travels. She said it and heard Haldorson's voice behind her own, like an echo in a room where the walls have changed, but the shape remains. A typical teaching visit lasted 2 to 3 hours. Ruth would walk the floor, identify the coldest zone by touch, mark the sleeping area, and show the homesteader how to dig, dry, lay, fill, and cap. She brought her own lime clay mix when the household had none. She brought corks and rag plugs when the household had no way to seal their bottles. She never charged for the visits. She never refused one. The visit to the Flatten claim taught her something she had not expected. Arne Flatten was a bachelor who had filed on a quarter section 3 miles west of the settlement. His dugout was deeper than Ruth's, cut into a steep bank that kept the room cool in summer, but bitterly cold in winter. He had tried to insulate the floor with hay, which had rotted, and then with canvas, which had frozen to the earth and torn when he tried to pull it up. He had 80 bottles and no idea what to do with them beyond what the settlement gossip told him, which was bury them. Ruth walked his floor. She knelt in the sleeping area and pressed both palms down. The cold was immediate and sharp, worse than her own dugout had been in September, because the deeper cut meant more earth surface in contact with the room, and the bank above channeled moisture downward through the walls. Your problem is not just the floor, she said. The walls are conducting cold, too. The bank above is saturated. I cannot bottle the walls. No, but you can bottle the floor and reduce the load on the stove by half. The stove can fight the walls if it does not also have to fight the ground. She showed him the dig, 4 inches down. She tested his clay. Too wet near the surface, better at depth. She showed him the finger roll test Jonas had taught her. She showed him the staggered rows and watched him lay the first 12 bottles himself, correcting his spacing twice, adjusting his neck-to-base alternation once. Tighter, she said. Push them until they touch. The fill goes in the gaps, not between the bottles. He pushed. The row tightened. Ruth packed the fill and showed him how to press it with his thumbs until no gap wider than a finger remained. When you cap this, she said, do it in thin layers, not one thick pour. Thin layers cure from the top, thick layers crack from the inside. How thin? 1/2 inch. Tamp each one before you add the next. By the time you have 2 inches, the cap is one solid piece, not a slab sitting on top of bottles. Flatten nodded. He was learning. Not just the method, the principle. Ruth could see it in his eyes the moment when the hands stop imitating and the mind starts understanding. What she asked for in return was bottles. Every household she helped owed her nothing except the agreement that they would save their empties and pass them to the next family that needed them. The bottles circulated. They moved from claim to claim like a currency that never lost its value, because the value was not in the glass, but in the air inside it. By midsummer, Ruth estimated that 11 households within a day's ride had some version of the bottle floor, ranging from full-room installations like hers to single sleeping corner patches like the Solheims. The method was not uniform. Each household had adapted it to their own conditions. Birgit had added a layer of dry hay beneath the bottles for extra cushion. Lunde had used stoneware crocks exclusively because he could not find enough glass. The Solheims had expanded their corner patch to half the room using bottles donated by 3 neighbors. Arne Flatten had experimented with laying bottles vertically instead of horizontally in a section near his stove, and reported that the vertical bottles were harder to cap, but held their position better under the stove's weight. The method was spreading not because Ruth promoted it, but because the winter had been convincing. People who had frozen on plank floors and earthen floors and hay-insulated floors had seen or heard about the dugout where 4 people survived the worst night on a bed of buried glass. They did not need to understand the physics. They needed to understand that it worked. And Ruth was the proof. It was in August of 1881 that Silas Brame's arc reached its conclusion. Ruth was at the mercantile buying salt when Aldous Kip mentioned, with the careful neutrality of a man who does not take sides but notices everything, that Brame had been seen hauling bottles behind his storage shed. "What kind of bottles?" Ruth said. Whiskey bottles, beer bottles. The same kind he gave away by the cartload last September when you were pulling them from his trash heap." "What is he doing with them?" Kip looked at her over the counter. "He is laying them beneath the floor of the shed where he keeps the kegs. He says the cider froze last winter and split 3 barrels. He says the beer froze and pushed the taps. He's building a bottle floor under the storage room to keep the kegs from freezing through." Ruth stood in the mercantile and absorbed this information. The man who had said she would beg to sell by Christmas. The man who had called her a scavenger and predicted her failure to everyone who would listen. The man who had sent Fisher with $40 and a buyer's confidence. That man was now on his hands and knees behind his own shed, burying bottles in the dirt, using the method he had mocked because the method worked and his kegs did not care about his pride. She could have gone to the saloon. She could have stood in the doorway and watched him work and said nothing, which would have been the cruelest reply. She could have offered to help, which would have been the kindest. She could have laughed, which would have been the most human. She did none of these. She waited. 3 days later, Brame came to her. He did not ride to the claim. He walked, which meant he had chosen to spend the time that walking required, which meant the visit was deliberate and not casual. He arrived in the late afternoon when Ruth was outside mixing cap material for a repair on the threshold section that needed seasonal attention. He stood 10 feet away and watched her work. His hands were at his sides. He was not smiling. He was not performing. For the first time since Ruth had known him, Silas Brame looked like a man who had something to say and no angle from which to say it. "The cap layer," he said. "Mine is cracking." Ruth did not look up. She continued mixing. "How thick?" "An inch, maybe less." "That is too thin. 2 inches minimum, 3 beneath anything heavy." "I used mud, no lime." "Then it will crack every time the temperature swings. You need lime in the mix. Burn limestone. It sets harder and does not shrink." Silence. Brame shifted his weight. Ruth mixed. "I only copied what works," he said. Ruth looked up then. Brame's face was the face of a man paying a debt he had not planned to owe. There was no warmth in it, no conversion, no revelation, no moment of light breaking through clouds. Just a man standing in front of a woman he had tried to ruin, admitting with 5 words that she had been right and he had been wrong, and the world had not arranged itself according to his predictions. "Everyone copies what works," Ruth said. "That is how it spreads." She showed him the lime-burning method. She showed him the staggered rows. She showed him the fill technique and the tamping rhythm, and the 2-day cure under controlled heat. She did not enjoy it. She did not resent it. She taught him the way she taught everyone, completely, patiently, without withholding anything that would make the difference between a floor that held and a floor that cracked. Brame left with a bucket of lime clay mix and the knowledge that the woman whose claim he had tried to buy for $40 had just given him something worth more than the claim itself. He never apologized. Ruth never asked him to. On the frontier, the apology was the act of walking 2 miles to ask for help from the person you had wronged. The words did not matter. The walking did. In September of 1881, a man named Dr. Amos Reed arrived in the settlement. Reed was a physician, not the frontier kind who carried a bag of whiskey and a bone saw, but a trained one, educated in Philadelphia, who had come west after his wife's death from tuberculosis because the East held too many rooms where she had been alive and was not anymore. He was 41, thin, quiet, and possessed of the particular competence that comes from years of making decisions where the wrong one kills someone. He heard about Ruth's floor on his second day in the settlement. Kip told him about it at the mercantile, the way Kip told everyone about everything factually without opinion, like a man reading the weather. Reed visited the claim 2 days later. He told Ruth he was interested in the method not because he built floors, but because he treated the illnesses that bad floors caused: chest complaints, joint pain, frostbite on extremities that rested against frozen ground, infant mortality in the first winter, which was higher than any physician's conscience could accept. If your floor reduces the cold reaching sleeping bodies, Reed said, it reduces the conditions that produce the illnesses I treat. I would like to understand how it works. Ruth showed him. She pulled up the inspection corner and explained the layers. She described the principle: still air as insulation, contact breakage, the difference between fighting the air and fighting the ground. She described the cap composition and the lime burning and the staggered rows. Reed listened the way physicians listen, with his whole attention, asking questions only to clarify, not to challenge. When she finished, he pressed his palm to the capped floor and then to the bare ground outside the doorway. The same test everyone performed, the same test that always produced the same result. How many children have slept on this floor since November? He said. Elsie, the Veen baby for one night, 2 of Birgit Haugen's children on visits. And how many of them have had chest complaints this winter? Elsie had a fever during the first storm. It broke in one night. The others, I do not know for certain, but Martha says her baby has been healthier since they insulated their own bed corner. Reed looked at Ruth with an expression she had not seen from a man since Haldorsen. Not pity, not charity, recognition. The look of a person who sees competence and responds to it with respect. May I accompany you on your teaching visits? He said. I would like to see the other installations and compare the health outcomes. You may, Ruth said. But I walk. I do not have a horse. Then I will walk with you. He did. Through the autumn of 1881, Amos Reed walked with Ruth Calder to every claim where she had taught the bottle method. He examined floors, interviewed families, and recorded in a small leather notebook the details that Ruth knew by instinct and he needed to quantify: sleeping temperatures measured by the mercury thermometer he carried, moisture levels tested with a strip of blotting paper pressed to the cap surface, the number and severity of cold weather ailments reported by each household. Their courtship, if it could be called that, grew from these walks. Not from conversation about feelings or futures, but from the shared work of visiting claims and talking about floors and children, and the gap between what the frontier demanded and what the frontier provided. On one visit to the Solheim claim, where Ruth's 63-bottle corner patch had survived the rest of the winter, Reed crouched beside the baby's crib and examined the child's feet. He held the small toes in his fingers and pressed gently along the nail beds, checking for the discoloration that comes from chronic cold exposure. No frostbite, he said. No chilblain. This child slept on that corner all winter. Since late March, Ruth said. Ragna kept him on the patch and nowhere else. Reed looked at the corner, then at the cracked and heaved earth that made up the rest of the floor. He wrote something in the notebook. Then he looked at Ruth. The children on uninsulated floors that I examined last week all had chilblain on the toes and heels. 2 had early frostbite. 1 had joint swelling from sustained cold exposure. This child has none of that. 1 child is not proof. No, but 11 families and 19 children across 9 months is beginning to look like evidence. It was the first time anyone had used a word like evidence about the bottle floor. Ruth had thought in terms of warm and cold, holding and failing, surviving and not surviving. Reed thought in terms of data, comparison, and outcomes measured across populations. They were looking at the same floor and seeing different things, and both things were true. Reed carried the bucket of lime clay mix on the visits because Ruth's hands, scarred and cracked from a year of digging and mixing, could no longer grip the bale handle without pain. She did not ask him to carry it. He simply took it from her the second time they walked together, and she let him, and neither of them commented on the transfer because commenting would have made it something other than what it was, a practical act between two people who understood that help, offered without being requested, was the most honest kind. They married in the spring of 1882 in the settlement, with Elsie standing beside Ruth and holding a bouquet of prairie grass because there were no flowers in April on the Dakota plains. Pryor attended. Martha attended. Brame did not, but he sent a case of empty bottles with a note that said only, "For the next floor." Reed did not move on to Ruth's claim. Ruth did not move into the settlement. They built. Over the next 3 years, they expanded the dugout into a hybrid dwelling, the original underground room preserved as the core, with sod walls raised above grade on 3 sides and a proper frame roof replacing the brush and earth ceiling that had leaked every spring. The bottle floor remained beneath it all, untouched, still doing its work. Reed built a small clinic room attached to the south wall of the house, where he treated patients from the surrounding claims. Ruth's floor extended under the clinic. Families brought sick children there in winter and laid them on the warmest surface in the territory, a bed above 467 bottles and 9 crocks, holding their still air in the dark. Reed called it the warm room. Patients called it Ruth's room. Both names were accurate. They had 2 children of their own, a son, Thomas, named for Ruth's father, the cooper who had crouched in lantern light and pressed bottles into chaff and taught his daughter a principle she would not use for 20 years. A daughter, Solveig, named for a woman Ruth had never met but whose husband had made the floor possible, and whose name Ruth had learned in a dugout on a winter night while burning limestone and listening to an old man describe the fjords. The years compress the way years do when the crisis has passed, and the work of living replaces the work of surviving. Ruth continued teaching through the 80s. New settlers arrived each spring with the same confidence and the same ignorance about Dakota winters, and each autumn the ones who had listened came to Ruth for advice on their floors. The ones who had not listened came in January, when listening was no longer optional. She taught Elsie the method fully, not just the hands, but the understanding. Why still airworks? Why the cap must be dry before it is walked on? Why the rows must stagger? Why the method has limits and must not be pushed past them? Elsie, who had sorted bottles at 6 and counted them at 7 and slept on them every night of her childhood, understood the floor, the way a child understands the house they grew up in, not as a technique, but as a fact of life. Thomas, when he was old enough to grip a shovel, helped Ruth repair the threshold cap each autumn. He did not love the work the way Elsie did. He loved what came after the work, the people who came to the clinic, the ailments his father treated, the connection between a warm floor and a healthy body. He would become a physician like his father, and when he treated children's frostbite in later years, he would ask their parents one question before anything else. What is under your floor? By 1885, Ruth estimated that more than 30 households within 2 days' ride had some version of the bottle insulation. Root cellars, nursery corners, full floors in dugouts and sod houses, milk crock shelves lined with bottle beds to slow the freeze, warming benches near stoves with bottle cores that held heat from the day and released it slowly through the night. The method did not spread because it was brilliant. It spread because it was free. Bottles cost nothing. Clay cost nothing. Ash cost nothing. The only cost was labor and understanding, and Ruth gave the understanding away to anyone who walked onto her claim and asked. The settlement grew, frame houses appeared, rail access improved. The raw desperation of first settlement passed into the steadier rhythm of established community. Plank floors with proper crawl space insulation replaced the bottle method in newer, wealthier homes. But in the dugouts and sod houses that still dotted the poor claims, and in the root cellars where winter stores needed protection, the bottles remained. The visible change was small but unmistakable. Behind Bream, who had once mocked the woman who gathered his trash, now set his empties aside in wooden crates by the back door, sorted roughly by size, because it was less trouble to organize them than to deal with the parade of homesteaders who came looking for glass. He never acknowledged what this meant. He simply did it. And Ruth, when she passed the saloon on her way to the mercantile, sometimes glanced at the crates and allowed herself the smallest expression that was not quite a smile. The second winter, 1881 into 82, was less severe than the hard winter, but still tested every shelter on the plains. Ruth's floor held without incident. Martha's bed corner patch held. Torsten Lunde's sleeping area held. The Solheim repair held. Birgit Haugen reported that her sleeping corner was the warmest part of her sod house, warmer than the area directly beside the stove because the stove heated the air above, but the bottles protected the body below. Reed documented all of it. His leather notebook filled with entries that measured the difference between insulated and uninsulated sleeping surfaces across 17 households. He did not publish the findings. There was no journal that would accept a study of whiskey bottles buried in dugout floors. But he kept the record, and years later, when Thomas Reed followed his father into medicine, the notebook was among the first things he read. Ruth lived on the same claim where she had buried Matthew. The dugout room, now the oldest part of a house that had grown around it like bark around a wound, still held its original bottle floor beneath boards that Reed had laid over the cap when the children began crawling. The boards rested directly on the surface. There was no air gap. There did not need to be. The bottles did not need ventilation. They needed only to hold still. Reed died in 1893 of pneumonia in the clinic room he had built on the south wall. It was March, the same month Jonas Halldorsen had died 12 years earlier, in the same kind of weather, from the same kind of illness that the plains extracted from men who spent their winters walking between claims in wind and cold. Ruth sat beside him through the last night, the way she had sat beside Matthew 13 years before. But this time she was not on an overturned bucket in a dugout with a dirt floor. She was in a chair, in a room with a proper roof and plastered walls, and the floor beneath her feet held 467 bottles and 9 crocks that had kept this family alive through the worst winter the territory had known. She buried him on the rise beside Matthew, in ground that was easier to dig now because 20 years of settlement had loosened the topsoil with plows and roots, and the passage of many feet. 3 graves on the rise, 2 husbands, and a claim that had outlasted them both. She did not remarry. She continued teaching when asked. She raised Thomas and Solveig on the claim with Elsie's help. And when Elsie married and moved to the claims north of the creek, Ruth managed alone because managing alone was something she had learned to do in a September when the alternative was dying. She grew old the way frontier women grew old, not gracefully, not gently, but with the particular durability of a body that has been used for its purpose and has not yet agreed to stop. Thomas went east for medical schooling and came back to practice in the settlement his father had served. Solveig stayed on the claim with Ruth until Ruth could no longer manage the stairs to the upper room, and then managed them anyway because she did not believe in admitting to walls what she had not admitted to weather. In her later years, Ruth sometimes walked to the original dugout room and stood on the board floor that covered the cap, that covered the bottles, that covered the earth. She could feel nothing through the layers. The bottles moved between claims like a shared tool, collected after Saturdays, saved through summers, buried before the first frost by families who understood that the cheapest material on the plains was also the most useful one. Ruth Calder lived on the original claim until 1899, when she moved into the settlement to be near Thomas's medical practice. She was 51. Her hands, scarred at every knuckle from years of clay and lime and glass, could no longer grip a shovel, but she could still press her palm flat to a floor and tell you in 3 seconds whether the cold had found its way through. She died in the winter of 1903 in a room with a proper plank floor and was buried on the rise beside Matthew and Amos, in ground she had bought with her body and held with her mind. Enoch Pryor had told her in the September of 1880, when the dugout was unfinished and the earth floor was wet and her daughter slept on dirt that pulled warmth from a child's body like water from a sponge, he had told her plainly, with the authority of a man who had buried his own son to the cold, "If you sleep your little girl on wet dirt this winter, you will wake beside a body." Years later, in the room Ruth Calder had built from nothing, another child lay sleeping in the warm corner while wind dragged snow across the claim outside. Under the boards, under the worn rag rug, under the clay cap patched and mended and hardened with lime across 20 winters. The buried bottles still held their pockets of dead air in the dark. No one looking at the room would know what was beneath it. No one would guess that the warmth under the bed came from something the world had thrown away. She could not afford a proper floor, though she built one the cold did not understand.